Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am very much looking forward to my conversation with Alan Gallant so we can discuss his new podcast, Collinsport After Dark. But before we get to that, I do have some very sad news. Marcy Robin, the longtime editor of Shadowgram, has passed away. This was announced on the Dark Shadows news page. Marcy was an instrumental figure in the Dark Shadows fandom. Marcy was involved going back to the late 70s. She became involved in the ShadowCon events in California. She continued to be involved as a member of the committee at the Dark Shadows festivals. She handled the costume contests and did many other things for the festivals. And of course, Shadowgram, the Dark Shadows newsletter, which many fans, myself included, would look forward to receiving in the mail. It was always a thrill to get a Shadowgram in the mail, and true labor of love and an immense amount of work and effort. Those are just a few of the things Marcy did. She was a great fanfic writer as well, and one of her short stories was used in one of the Big Finish Dark Shadows audio dramas called Hellwind. She was a school teacher in Temple City, California. A huge, huge loss to the Dark Shadows fan community. I did not know Marcy was ill, and I was just thinking about her earlier this week and saying to myself, I have to try to reach out to Marcy Robin to see if she would want to do one of these podcasts. I had Kathy Resch on the podcast before, but Marcy Robin was certainly someone I would have loved to have talked to. I was very sad to hear about her passing, and my deepest condolences go out to her many friends and family.
Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Danielle, or am I Penny Dreadful? I don't know the difference anymore, but one thing I do know is that I have an excellent guest here with me today, Alan Gallant, who is an actor, educator, theater technician, and stage manager, currently living in Florida. Alan is originally from Maine, where he grew up. He's joining me today to talk about his great new YouTube show / podcast, Collinsport After Dark. Alan, welcome to Terror
Thank you so
Collinwood.
much. I appreciate it very much.
Oh my goodness, it's great. It's great having you here. I was just talking to you right before we started recording, but we had corresponded over the last couple of years. You sent me like the breakdown of the gum cards, and we'd write back and forth. And then the other day I was looking on YouTube, just kind of surfing, and on my feed I see Collinsport After Dark, Alan Gallant, and I said, "What? Alan has a show? Oh my goodness!" So I watched it immediately, and I immediately loved it. It's a really great show. I love just that you infuse so much research into it and humor as well. I love cheap Nicholas Blair.
Oh, yes.
Cheap Nicholas Blair, yes. And but you really go to town on the research, on the topics that you do, and you use clips from the show to illustrate certain points that you're making, and it's really exciting to see a new Dark Shadows podcast. We're bringing it back to New England because you're a native New Englander too. I love B is for Barnabas with your Red Sox.
B is for Barnabas and for Bangor.
But, oh, that's right, yeah. So yeah, so we're keeping it in ye old haunted New England here, but
yes.
you're in Florida now, but it's in your blood.
It's totally in my blood. The only thing that's not in my blood anymore are the temperatures. Wintertime, just a little bit too chilly.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, right now I just took Crispy out before we started recording, and it's just really outside. It's very unpleasant out there right now. But
I want to talk to you about, before we get into the podcast, I want to talk to you a little bit about how you originally got into Dark Shadows, and you talk a little bit about this in your own show, but I'd like to explore that a little bit if you would.
Sure. So I was born in Bangor, long too many years ago, but I grew up in a small town called Glenburn, which is right outside of Bangor. It's like 6 or 7 miles outside of the center of town.
Mhm.
And it was a tiny little town of 1,500 people. There's not a lot to do to stimulate your imagination in a tiny little town except run around in the woods and do various things and go to school. And so when I was not quite 7 years old, it was in February of 1966, I turned on the TV after coming home from school. And I didn't have to run home from school. I lived right next door to the school, which was convenient and inconvenient. If I wanted to pretend to be sick, I had to pretend all day long. Otherwise, mother would send me home. But I turned on the television, and come to find out later, it turned out to be episode 172, which was the episode in which a seance had been held and it sort of outed Laura the Phoenix. Dr. Guthrie was
Yeah.
involved. And at the end of that episode, they play the tape recorder because they had set a tape recorder up and nothing is on it except the crackling of fire. And
Yeah.
that was what I saw. And of course, it was in black and white, would have been anyway. I had a 19-inch Zenith portable television set. It was black and white. So that's what I grew up with. And but I didn't think a lot about it, except I really liked the vibe of it. I liked the mood, I liked the music, I liked the fact that there were shadows everywhere and there's a fire crackling and all this sort of thing. And it sort of interested me, but I didn't really think too much about it because that was all there was. It was an image to me at that point.
Mhm.
So a number of months later, I had some friends at school that were started talking about this vampire that was sinking his teeth into everybody on the show. And I said, I kind of remember that show. So I went back and I started watching it. And I really started picking it up probably around the time that David was being threatened. But I have memories of it from about 1968 on.
Mhm.
So David Collins being threatened by the vampire was kind of like, it's like a scare thrill for
Yeah.
kids. And so we talked and we talked and we talked all about that. Is he gonna get him, and all this sort of thing, and in our own kid way. And that's how I got started on it. I didn't really get fully imprinted and addicted to it until later, like in 68, and certainly by 1897, when the stories became really, I don't know, more vivid, I guess, for my perception of it. And I saw it in color a few times during 1897, which really like blew my mind. So
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Were
yeah.
you so you said you were, your friends at school were watching it too? Were you, so you'd have conversations about,
We'd have convos, and a little bit later on, we would actually do play acting. We'd do improvisations, and we would fight over who played what characters.
Oh, cool. Who were you?
Well, I was the shy kid, believe it or not, and a lot of shy kids going to the theater eventually.
Same. Yeah, same
Yeah,
here. Yeah.
yeah. So I ended up, I would end up playing Willie, or one of the ancillary. Once in a while, like, let him play Barnabas. He hadn't played Barnabas in a while, so that would be fun. I had one friend, Earl Murphy, who's since passed on, but he was my best bud for 2 or 3
Oh,
years
yeah.
in grade school and middle school, and we were heavy into Dark Shadows. Had another friend, Wade Curtis, who's still around. He lives in New Hampshire,
Oh,
and
okay.
we used to do the same thing all the time. So
Mhm.
that was kind of the whole thing. But there were a lot of kids that were very, very aware of the show at my school
Yeah.
at the time. So
That must have been also, I mean, I'm in New England, but I'm in Massachusetts. So you were in Maine where the show was set. So that must have been an additional kind of
oh, it
fun
was
aspect to it.
every time Roger said, "Oh, these trips to Bangor," I'd go like, "Yeah, come to Bangor. Bring Barnabas."
That's great. I love it. I love that. Did you, I want to get into your, when you, on your show where you talk about the bubblegum cards and stuff, were you collecting any of the Dark Shadows merchandise at that time as well?
I didn't really have an opportunity to. I had
Mm.
friends that had the game, so we would
Okay.
play the game once in a while. I remember doing that, and I had a few friends that would like have the cards or whatever, but I
Yeah.
never. The stores that we went to didn't seem to have them for some strange reason.
Mhm.
they were kind of more of a mom and pop thing. We were going to local AMP most of the time. So
Yeah.
they didn't
Mhm.
have, they had the 16 magazines, which I used to voraciously
Yeah.
read
Mhm.
back in the day. So,
Yeah.
but so I had some of the 16 magazines. I had, I would
Famous
say,
Monsters,
I
52.
had,
I saw.
well, I got that later, actually.
Oh, did you?
That's
Okay.
a more recent acquisition. A lot of what I have is much more recent acquisition, but
I see.
I also had a bunch of paperback novels,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
a bunch
Mhm.
of those, and those kind of kept me connected to the show even after it went off the air for a little while. But
Mhm.
I wasn't, I didn't have. I had to go begging if I wanted money, pocket money. I didn't have
Sure.
what we call an allowance,
Right.
so there wasn't a lot of that. My
Yeah.
parents provided very well for me, but there wasn't a lot of extra frou-frou
Yeah.
on those days. So
Mhm.
I
Did you go see House and Night of Dark Shadows when those came out?
I did not. I saw
Mm.
House much later.
Oh,
Much,
later. Okay.
much later. Yeah,
Yeah.
like a decade later. So
Yeah. No, were you also a fan of other stuff of that nature, like Universal or Hammer horror films or any of that stuff, or was it or sci-fi fantasy kind of
I
stuff or
liked anything that had atmosphere.
oh
I never liked body horror or any of that sort of thing.
no,
That's
yeah,
kind of the vogue today. I liked
yeah,
what you referred to as terror as opposed to horror.
yes, yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, there was certainly a lot of that going on. So I watched, you know about Eddie Driscoll.
Oh,
So,
Eddie Driscoll, yeah,
yeah,
sure, yeah.
he was a horror host when I was a little boy,
Yeah,
doing Weird, and
weird, yeah.
did, I think, Crandall was the one I saw him, the later one that I
Hmm.
saw him do, the guy with the third eye.
Yeah,
Uh, but, um, that was kind of my thing. I liked the vibe of it, and I didn't start consuming literature until I was probably 10, 11, 12 in there, and I started devouring the classics in terms of that, Frankenstein, Dracula. Um, I didn't read Henry James until a bit later in high
hmm,
school, I think.
yeah,
But all that sort of that spook vibe rather than the screaming horror vibe was
right.
always part of my childhood. And my mother occasionally would forbid me from watching Dark Shadows because I would have nightmares about the werewolf or something. And one occasion, I have a brother that's 10 years older than me,
Mhm.
and when I was about 8, the werewolf was really starting to pick up on Dark Shadows. And one night, probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, he finds me behind the door of my bedroom with the in the corner behind the door. So I'm like hiding behind there, and my face is in the corner. I'm going, hey up, the werewolf's getting me. I'm completely asleep. So he just takes me and puts me back into bed. And the next day, I don't know what happened until I'm told. So my mother says, "You're not watching that show anymore." And I go, what? And of course, I whine and I wheedle for about 2 or 3 days, and she relents. But it had that kind of effect on me occasionally, and it was usually the real jump scares that
Yeah,
did it. The rest of it was like I ate it up. It was no
yeah,
problem.
yeah, yeah. I had nightmares too. My mom at one point, she had been a fan in the 60s, but my uncle Val was a hardcore fan at that time, but he was the one showing me all the Dark Shadows episodes. So I was having nightmares too. And she, at one point, said to him like, "Oh, you got, there's too many bad dreams, we got to stop this now." And I, I was like, "No, I want to keep watching it."
Yeah.
It was, yeah, I would have, especially, with the Barnabas terrorizing David and stuff. Like I would have dreams where I was in those situations, like
Oh yeah.
where I'm in the old house and I hear the dogs howling and the doors shut, and I remember that
Yeah.
happens to David, and I'd have dreams like that, and I'd know Barnabas was coming and stuff. But I couldn't get enough of it. I had to keep going back for more. So you got into the theater. Was Dark Shadows an influence in that respect at all?
Yeah, because of all the play acting and the improvisation that we kids used to do, it
Hmm.
got me involved in that a lot. It also got me interested in history of a sort,
Hmm.
particularly Victorian history because of the 1897 period. But so I got interested in research through Dark Shadows. I didn't get my degrees until I was in my 40s,
Hmm.
and when I had gone to college for a short time before, but in between, it was about 17 or 18 years before I went back to school. And I was doing research as a hobby. I mean, this is something that most people don't normally do. So, or at least most people that I knew wouldn't normally do this sort of thing. But I used to go to the Bangor Public Library and do microfilm research. This would have been back in the 80s and 90s. And I gather a lot of information about dark shadows through that. So I've been doing that for years, kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
But it definitely influenced my getting into the theater. I did not come into the theater by the normal way. I wasn't a theater kid at all. We
Same.
didn't
Yeah.
have, yeah, we didn't have anything in our high school.
Mhm.
So we did senior plays, which meant we did these goofy little comedy one acts kind of thing. We weren't doing Antigone or, Shaw or anything like that. We were just doing silly stuff that would make our parents laugh. And so that's how I got into it. And I got convinced by my senior advisor to dress in drag for one of the shows. And it was like I fit back then. I was really tiny,
Mhm.
and I fit into my mother's dresses, and she never forgave me for that. She never forgave me for that. But I did. And I played an old lady in one of these.
Mhm.
It was a waiting room comedy at a doctor's office kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's how I kind of got into it. But then I took one class in community college. And then for a couple of years, nothing really. I did various odd jobs. I worked in the woods with a friend of mine. I did drywall and construction. I was just kind of floating around a bit.
Mhm.
And eventually I was given, I think my mother noticed it in the paper because she'd gone to this theater. Lakewood Theater is in Madison, Maine. It is an old Broadway tryout house from the 30s and 40s. It is the longest running summer stock theater in the country.
Oh, wow.
It's been
Yeah.
running since 1901.
Mhm.
And it's now run by a group of, it's called the Cornville Players. They're a community theater group, and they've kept it
Mhm.
going. They've raised money and they've worked on the building and kept it going. Originally, it was a 700-seat house, big Broadway style, fly space, the whole 9 yards. When I worked there, it was the last 2 years. It was an Actors Equity Theater, so it was a union house. So I got training there, and that's how I got started. Um,
Mhm.
Weirdly, it's like you sink or swim. You either love it or you hate it because you're working 14 to 16 hours a day,
Yeah.
and they're not paying you anything, but they're telling you you're privileged because we're not asking you to pay us to learn all
Right.
this. And they're right, because a lot of these internships and stuff cost money.
Yeah.
And this was back in 82, 83. Both those
Mhm.
summers I worked at Lakewood Theater and worked with Susan Stroman, if you know who that is.
Oh, yeah.
I worked with her. She played Roxy Hart in Chicago when we
Yeah.
did.
Wow.
Oh,
Cool.
that was a lot of fun, and a bunch of other Broadway people came through. So it was a great opportunity. I got to work with some Broadway designers, or work for them, I should say, because I was just a plebe at that time. But that was how I got involved. And within a year after that, I was working professionally as a shop foreman, set builder, what have you, and did it for a number of years. And then the acting started. And the acting happened sort of organically. It was not, I didn't come out of conservatory, and I was learning how to get rid of certain predilections in my speech from
Mm.
growing up in the Bangor area, because I would say get instead of gat, and
Yeah.
I would get practically clubbed by the directors for doing that. And I'm okay, I won't do that anymore. It's that kind of thing. And as I tell my speech students, every once in a while I get excited, and you'll hear it come back in,
Right.
and
Yeah.
that's kind of what that was. But then I got into acting, and I did that for 25 years. I actually split time for about 4 years and almost burned myself completely out doing that because I was just working from pillar to post. And but I was working full time in the shop and full time in rehearsal. It was like crazy stuff.
Wow.
But I
Wow.
was working under some other people, so I wasn't doing it all myself, which is
Mhm.
thank God, because it was bad enough. But
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then about 10, 12 years ago, I got back into the tech end of it because it was a steady paycheck and medical and all that good stuff. So
And you're doing that in Florida now. You're a
yeah, I'm in
technical
Winter Park.
director.
Yeah, I'm in Winter Park, Florida, which is just outside of Orlando. It's a smaller but very wealthy kind of posh little community. So there's support for theater there.
Mhm.
Rollins College is there, which is famous for its MBA, actually,
Mm,
is what they're famous for there.
yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
and my stepdaughter played soccer there and got a degree there. So,
Oh,
uh,
great. Yeah. You have this show that you started doing, and over the last couple of years, like I had mentioned, you'd sent me the breakdown of the bubblegum cards. The amount of research that you do is really impressive. And I mean, I'm just blown away by how you were able to correlate the images with the actual episodes that took place, even the photo shoots, like the promotional photo shoots. You figured out some of the dates that those
mhm,
took
mhm.
place. I want to ask you about how you went about doing that, but before I do, what made you decide to do a Dark Shadows podcast?
I got over the terror of doing, of
Oh,
thinking
really?
about
Yeah.
doing. That's how I motivate myself. I think about things for months and months and months,
Yeah.
and I figure, well, how am I going to start this? So I have to organize everything ahead of time. I have a bit of OCD, which you might have been able to tell from the detail of some of the stuff I do, but it's more or less under control. So I have fun with it now and do things I like to do with it. But yeah, it was that kind of a thing. It was, I thought about it and I thought about it and I thought about it. And I said, well, maybe I can do this. And I played around with iMovie so that I at least had a basic working knowledge of how
Yeah.
to do the editing and stuff because I hadn't touched that.
Mm.
And figured out, well, maybe I can use the audio to do this. And what can I use? And thank God, MPI and Dan Curtis Productions, as long as I don't try to monetize, they'll allow me to use the little clips. So
Mhm.
they always send me a little thing every time I post. It says copyrighted, but it's okay.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank
Yeah.
you, Jim Pearson and Dan Curtis Productions.
Yeah.
Um, but it's a hobby. It's a labor of love. So I'm never gonna monetize it anyway. So
And I love, back in the fanzine days, you had, I mean, there was just this proliferation of fanzines out there. You had such a variety, and they all had their own distinct flavors, and that's what I love. I wanted to see this happening with these types of shows, like YouTube shows and podcasts and things like that, because we have Resident of Collinwood with Jewel, and I know Patrick's on it, and Gordon,
yeah,
and quite often, and then we have Between the Shadows with Kara and Kristen. There's the Dark Paradise with Rachel, and there we have the literary license often covers Dark Shadows related topics. Plus, a lot of the classic horror podcasts touch on Dark Shadows quite often. Classic Horrors Club or Monster Kid Radio, Diecast movie podcast. But it's great to see for the new year, as we go into the new year, a new Dark Shadows show. One thing I really enjoy seeing you do is how you, for example, in the first episode, you got the records from Jeff Kenny that were used, the sound cues that were used, and Jeff has been on the show, and Jeff selling a lot of his collection right now, but that you obtained the records, the sound cues that Sybil Weinberger used to use, and then you figured out, you pulled the episode, and then you figured out how the sound was layered and explained, and your experience as a technical director in theater, I'm sure helped inform your knowledge
yeah.
of how that worked. Can you talk a little bit about that? How you figured that out?
Your interview with Nick Bezink also helped tremendously because he was talking about things other than video there for a few moments, and that
Yeah,
sort of
Nick's
like
great. Yeah.
ah,
Hmm.
clicked on that. So yeah, of course, I'm interested in how things work because of my technical experience. So I'm also interested in piecing together for my imagination's sake, how did the working day work there? I love the stories and I love the spackling and trying to figure out how to make everything work that,
Yeah.
that, that was practically day to day difficult for them to make work.
Yeah.
I love that stuff too. But I also love, touchstones like this little guy right here.
Oh, wow, the scarab. Is
Yeah. And so, I look for stuff that's connected to the show and whatnot. This is pretty common. You can find these.
Yeah. Wow.
As a matter of fact, and I think I don't know where they manufacture them, but even in Egypt, they would sell them for,
Mhm.
tourists and so on. But I got a good deal on that because
Yeah, it's
sometimes
for the audio listeners, Alan just held up the Laura scarab.
Arab. and it's
Yeah.
the genuine brass version.
Yeah.
Uh, I had for years a little plastic version of it because that was all I could find and afford, but I do that. The whole thing, that's the whole thing. uh, Jeff was selling those, and that's one of the more involved financially sets of things that I own right now, because it is directly associated with the show. I thought it
Mhm.
was worthy of trying to explain myself to family and
The
friends why
the records, you
money
mean?
on it. Yes, and it's brilliant. There's actually a let me grab one.
Sure. One of the great things I love too is that you actually demonstrated I think I would be nervous because it's like, oh, I don't want to scratch it or something, but you actually.
Oh, I bought a better I bought a better a phonograph for that purpose,
Oh,
turntable.
okay. Hmm.
So but these are also here we go, right there.
Yeah, yep.
See,
There's the.
you can see the bands on it there a
Yeah,
little bit.
yep.
The company that made these is Fine Recording Incorporated. It's a family-owned business. It was in New York City. They were on 57th Street, so they were just a couple of blocks away from the Studio 16 on 53rd Street. If you go Fine Recording Incorporated on Google, you can find an article written on it and how
Mhm.
they put it together. It basically, I didn't know much about these. What they are is acetates, and of course, rock and rollers have these put out as sort of they cut them first to make sure that they work, and then they make a mold from them, and then they make a stamper, and then they do the vinyl thing when they're
Mhm.
doing that. But these guys are made out of aluminum, and they're coated with lacquer. They're like dipped in lacquer, and they then take a lathe and they cut the grooves into it. And the reason I can play this on my turntable is because they were cut for stereo needles rather than acetate needles.
Okay.
The original ones were cut for acetate needles, which wore less. They didn't wear as much as a diamond needle or sapphire needle. These were cut particularly to be a little bit heavier wear. They're not designed to be played hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, which is why most of these it says 768. These were probably replacement discs for the original discs that were
Mm.
worn out.
Yeah.
And they had a whole bunch of them replaced in July of 1968, which is why I know they're the ones that were used in August of 1968, which is where the show that I used 554 was
Yeah.
aired. So
Yeah. It's remarkable that you're able to figure that out. It also is remarkable that Sybil Weinberger was able to, that she'd plan that out in advance and she'd have to drop the needle right, I mean, in the specific band to have the right,
oh,
because they were playing the music as they were taping the show. So
totally
yeah,
live, and the actors couldn't hear it, at
yeah,
least not most of it, because they've mentioned that in the past that they just didn't hear that stuff. They got cued by a stage manager if they needed a cue for sound.
yeah, yeah. I asked Lara directly about the Lara Parker, the late great Lara Parker, when she was on the pod. And she mentioned that they couldn't hear
Yeah,
the music. So yeah, I know that's remarkable too. I know Nick had mentioned they switched to carts, like that they would
parts that was in his era, late in the shows.
later. Yeah. So it's just amazing that Sybil,
Yeah.
I mean, every so often there would be a mistake,
You'd hear, yeah, a
but
little
but
rumble. And
but
yeah,
honestly, like, I mean, most of not no 99% of the time she seemed to get it right
I
on there.
think I think they were able in some cases. There are also this one. I don't know if you can see it, but there is a white grease pencil cue mark on this. There it is,
Oh
right there.
yes, yep.
Mark them so that they would know which cue they were using,
Hmm.
or which one was a popular cue that they used a lot, that sort of thing. But also they had double turntables.
Hmm.
I'm sure of this, and I think Nick even makes mention of it in your interview that they had something like that, and so they could cue them like a DJ,
Yeah,
so they could like stop it and just let their hand off of it, and it would go.
yeah,
So I think that probably helped in terms of cueing it a bit. Yeah, what a job. I mean, she had to pick the music. She had to then edit it and change it during rehearsals because, oh, that doesn't work after all, kind of thing
right.
going on. And then she had to probably make markings on the script for herself and also for the audio techs, because the audio techs were the ones that were going to pot the cue in. In other words, raise the volume so it could be heard, and then take the volume out when it was supposed to go out, and all that
Yeah.
sort of thing. So it's a lot of work. It's a tremendous amount of work for
Sure. And then all the sound effects that were involved as well. I know you talked about the sound being layered in as well. And I remember at one point I was on the podcast talking about Maggie Evans, that nightmare she had where she was screaming, and you sent me the link to the original scream from the horror record from
It
like we
was
figured.
a 1960 horror record, so we
Yeah.
knew that it had been previously done and was probably in some library somewhere as well.
Yeah.
Sound effects library that came.
ABC probably had, I'm sure and I remember writing to you and asking about the werewolf howl, because that howl for the werewolf is used. I've heard that in other things over the years, and I wonder
I think
where
that
that
may even go back to
originated.
Universal or something. I mean, that goes back a long ways.
Yeah.
The growls are different. I've never been able to find those, the
The,
werewolf growls and snarls. I've never been able to find those. Those were some kind of unique something that they had.
they had some. I'd love to get my hands on whatever sound effects library they had, that ABC provided for them to use or something, because it would be interesting to hear that. And Sybil Weinberger, she's still with us, thankfully. And I know a longtime Dark Shadows fan who's been on the podcast is planning to do an interview with her, but I'd love to get her on here at some point as
That
well.
would be lovely. That would be
She's
great.
kind of a little bit reclusive. She doesn't I don't think she even did the festivals as far as I know, but she was married
No,
to
her
Bob
husband
Costello.
did, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But you also, another thing, like as I mentioned a couple of times, the gum cards, the bubble gum cards. Like, how did you figure out specifically? I mean, some you can tell, from looking at, okay, this comes from this episode. Some are a little more difficult to place. Like you must have really examined, the hairstyle or
Oh,
the
yeah.
costumes or the
Yeah.
whatever they're wearing. Like, how did you figure that out?
OCD, that comes in handy for that. Definitely. Yeah, the Barnabas bangs are the Barnabangs, as we refer to them,
Yes.
are like fingerprints in a lot of cases.
Uh-huh.
Poor Vinny, there's no way that you could replicate them exactly every single day.
Mhm.
Excuse me, well, I glue this in exactly the same place while I put this graph paper on your face. No, it's not going to happen that way. So they were all a little bit different. Some days he looked a little messed up. He looked like he'd been out a little too late,
Yeah.
and because the bangs would be a little bit funky. But and then other days they'd look beautiful, like and that's kind of how I told
Mhm.
the difference. And that, and sometimes a different tie just to confirm it, or the dress, of course. The rehearsal dresses, they kind of mess you up, so you have to look for something else, because the Grayson Hall used to wear a green and gold smock all the time in rehearsal, so you
Mhm.
can't really tell. But the hairstyle that she wore in the Gum Card series, when that was like the first time, and you could tell that's a fresh cut. And I looked at it, and I looked at the first episode, and she kind of shows it off a couple of places in the episode where she just, I don't know if she'd actually just gotten it cut, or whether she just stopped wearing the wig or the fall that she'd been wearing,
Yeah.
or a combination of both. But you could tell that's where it came from.
Mhm.
I've got the same thing. Eventually, I want to do the green card set and the posters and all of that
Oh,
stuff.
great.
Probably
Yeah.
pepper them out between other things, but so as not to completely bore people that might not be quite as interested in the cards. But yeah, I definitely want to go through those, because that's part of what I've been doing. And it's really been a process of a lot of years of doing it and leaving it alone, and then coming back and doing something else because I discovered something about one of them or something like that. And
Right.
it's a never ending process. It's not really 100%. It's just kind of like pretty sure.
Well, your
Pretty sure.
research is great because you were able to not only look at the episodes, but you pulled, for example, from a photo in Famous Monsters of Filmland, and then correlating that to the Ron Barry interview with the cast. That Robert Rodan was there and Humbert Allen Estrid, and you started to kind of figure out based on those things too when certain photos were taken. There,
Yeah.
the ones that I think I was blown away by was the sort of the publicity shots, just the stock photos I'm like, how did he know that that stock photo was taken on that date? That was amazing. But with Ron Barry coming to the set, there were, they stuck around, took some pictures, and there were
Right.
other instances of that. So that was really fascinating.
A lot of the ones that don't have background with Jonathan Frid, and you also notice that he has the ring on the wrong finger.
Uh-huh.
I don't think I mentioned that.
I think you did. I think you did.
Maybe I did. Maybe I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
Because of the angle of the shot. That's
Mhm.
just put it on your left hand, that kind of thing. But he
Mhm.
also, his hair is very specific. One of the bangs is really kind of wiggly on
Mhm.
that particular episode, and that's episode 532-33.
Mhm.
That was also an episode at which there are pictures, which I didn't get to, but there are pictures of Carol Gould, who was president of Jonathan's fan club back then, or one of his bigger fan clubs. And she was also president of Humbert's fan club at that
Mhm.
time. She would visit the studio, and that was one of the days she did. It must have been a madhouse around there because there were kids in there and there were promo shots plus, oh, let's rehearse and let's actually tape, that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
it was pretty crazy.
I'm
Someday.
sure it was. Yeah, that must have been a really cool day to be at the studio with
Mhm.
all of the excitement going on and all of the activity going on. So you mentioned you're going to do the green card set and the pinups. What else can people expect from future episodes of
Well,
Collinsport After Dark?
the Quentin postcards, of
Oh
course.
yes, we got to do the postcards. Don't want to forget those.
Also, there are several, like I mentioned, 532, 533 is a big promo photo shoot day.
Mhm.
So I might like to examine that. 331 is a huge day. They started early morning rehearsals and kept shooting right up till tape time. So
Mhm.
there are a ton of photographs from episode 331. Um, there's a werewolf shoot that happens kind of, I'm pretty sure it's 699 just before they go into 1897, where the werewolf is kind of trapped in the mausoleum
Oh
situation.
yeah.
And there's also a picture from that, which is interesting, a tie into what was going on with the relationship with 16 magazine and Gloria Stavers, who was the editor in chief of 16 for many, many years. She went to the studio quite frequently and took a lot of pictures. You can tell her pictures because they're slightly overexposed. It's like no lines on the faces kind of thing.
Yeah.
But she got a lot of great historical pictures of a lot of rock bands back then too.
Mhm.
But she actually had a picture of herself taken with the werewolf at one point when she was there at the studio, probably interviewing people or getting them to fill out sheets or whatever, and deciding, oh well, we can't publish that in the paper, in the magazine, but we'll publish that.
Yeah.
However she's doing it. She used to correspond with Jonathan too. There's a couple letters out there where she corresponded with him because he was giving her pictures for one of their features. One in particular talks about My Life in Pics, which was one of the features that they used to do with the stars. And he sent her a picture of him with his grandfather when he was a little boy. You may have seen that picture
Mhm.
before. She writes him a letter about that.
Yeah.
One of the fans got a hold of that somehow and posted it, probably on Facebook a number of
Mhm.
years ago. It's crazy how much activity was going on in that studio. That
Yeah.
wasn't just rehearsing and taping. There was
Right.
a lot of stuff going on
There
because
was, and it's remarkable too how things still even all these years later keep turning up. Like I'm sure you've seen the pictures that Rob Saccone sent me because his uncle was a cameraman on Dark Shadows, so he sent Rob. I mean, it was shortly after I launched the podcast. Rob emailed me out of the blue and said, "Hey, my uncle was a cameraman on Dark Shadows, and he took all these pictures. Do you want to use them for anything?" Yes, yes,
yeah,
please,
absolutely.
yes,
Let me put them
please.
on my blog.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just those were never seen before. So that was, things like that keep turning up, which is really cool. And I'm sure there's more stuff out there. One thing I'd love to find out is the identity of Frenchie, who used to do the art, the
Frenchie
art.
Blanche. Yeah,
Frenchie Blanche
yeah, but
is Frenchie still out there, or is
I have
that?
no idea if she's still out there or not.
Yeah, some
I
people
do know
speculated that it might have been Gloria Stavers herself using a pseudonym, but I don't
maybe if
know.
I don't know if she was artistically inclined or not, but
I don't know.
those are pretty evocative of the time. I
They're
mean, those
cool. Yeah.
all the pictures of like Jim Morrison or
Yeah.
Paul Revere and the Raiders, with little
Yeah. Yeah.
flowers drawn next to them because it was pretty much pushed towards young women, which is why I used to get crap for having them when I was a kid because I was a little boy. And and I lived in an extremely cisgendered world back then too. So 1960s in small town America. So,
Yeah.
but I used to love to go to the A&P store and I go, 35 cents, Dad. It's all it is, 35 cents. And you would let me buy them.
Do you have all of the 16 magazines that have Dark Shadows
I
articles in them at this point?
Not all of them, but I'll tell you what I just did. I just ordered two more off of eBay that complete my 1970 with the specs and the regular magazines.
Oh,
I have
wow.
all the ones from 68, which is from like about mid 68 on when they started noticing that something was going on down there at Studio 16. And 1969, got all of those in the specs as well. So what I've really got left are there's not every single issue of 71 has them, but there's a few key issues
Uh, and then
of
Tiger Beat too.
1971, and I've got some Tiger Beats.
Yeah.
I've got I just bought a lot of these probably about 3 or 4 months ago, and these puppies, yeah, this is my favorite one of Tiger Beat right here, and I've got some Flip too,
Yeah.
but this
Oh,
one,
yeah, I have that one too.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's one of the best covers in terms of the Dark Shadows covers
Yeah.
from
I
Tiger.
wonder how many total teen magazines ran articles on Dark Shadows. There were so
An
many.
enormous amount of them, and it was
Yeah.
amazing considering that even the ones on the West Coast finally figured it out, like
Yeah.
Tiger Beat West Coast magazine. So
Yeah.
they took them all to catch up to Stavers at 16, but they
Sure.
did.
They did.
Uh,
Yeah.
Ann Moses was the editor in chief of Tiger Beat, and she also used to assistant edit some of the other West Coast magazines with her friend
Yeah.
Laura Powell. And Ann Moses has a book out called Meow,
Mhm.
and it's about her experience at Tiger Beat with all of
Oh.
the wonderful stars that she met, and she actually dated Morris Gibb for a while.
Mhm.
So it's pretty
Wow.
cool.
Yeah. I have some of the teen magazines. I have a lot of the monster magazines from that era, and into the 70s as well. Especially the ones that have Dark Shadows on the cover. I love the painted covers, that look, I mean, there's
Go-Go's cover
the
is really
Go-Go's covers iconic, yeah. But I have some up here that I just kind of
yes, you do.
hang them up on the
Yeah,
wall up there. Uh,
awesome.
Another thing I'd love to see you do is, I don't know if you can see it, but I have, like you showed the scarab, the
Yes,
origins of things like that. Like I have the carousel there that they used to create the playroom carousel.
they just added some stuff to it, I guess, but it's the
They
same one.
did. Yeah, yeah. The little, metal tin merry-go-round there.
Yeah,
Was the company Chine? I think it was Chien, I think it was called. But yeah, things like that, which were not created specifically for Dark Shadows, but were acquired and then repurposed for Dark Shadows is kind of a fun thing to look at. Like the cane,
yeah,
that
right.
company that makes the cane and things. Those are kind of fun things to know about too.
They are. They are. The cane originally, I think, is from Germany.
Yeah.
It was sold by. It was sold by the ones that they got for the show were Uncle Sam Canes and
Mhm.
Umbrellas, and it's a
Mhm.
business that no longer exists, but it was there in New York City on Manhattan, very close to the studio,
Mhm.
and that's where they got a lot of that stuff
Yeah.
from. But yeah, they're everyday, not everyday items, but they're available items
Right.
uh, that were they became part of the iconography of the show, like
The ring, the Barnabas, yeah,
right,
the
ring.
ring, and Julia's medallion, which a lot of people have tried to figure out where that comes from. And Patty Karapinar was kind enough to, I should show this off more often.
Yes, you should, because it's very, very cool. Yeah, that's awesome.
The Julia medallion, yeah.
An excellent
Oh,
job on that.
it's really,
Excuse me.
yeah. Look into the center of
I
the.
will, okay.
But yeah, I know people have tried to kind of figure out where that came from, and
I
there.
thought it was like something like Sarah Coventry or something, but
Mm,
I can't, nobody's been able to find it. There's
mhm.
certain things that have been very, very difficult or impossible for people to find,
Yeah.
but we keep trying.
Right.
Our
Yeah.
he makes us keep trying. So,
Before we wrap things up, I want to ask you a couple questions here. So, how did you discover the Dark Shadows fandom? So you were a fan as a kid.
mhm.
How did you kind of come back into the Dark Shadows world?
Okay, the first thing that happened was in 1982. I'm down at Lakewood Theater in the summertime doing slave labor and learning the trade. And there's a television station in Poland Spring, Maine called WMTW Channel 8. And they were running the package. They were running the package, and I saw a couple of episodes down there on a little tiny black and white TV, which was very nostalgic because I watched most of them on black and white TV anyway when I was a kid, and so that kind of got me going. And weirdly, when I went back up to Bangor after the summer was over, I realized that if I placed my antenna the right way, I could pick up the audio from WMTW. And so what I did with one of these, which I've repurchased since. It's a Panasonic um,
Yeah.
tape recorder, a
Mhm.
cassette tape recorder. I
Yeah.
recorded a bunch of the shows. Now, this isn't the original tape. I've just sort of re-recorded them, but this is an original era tape. This is from like the mid 70s. This is a Kmart tape from the mid 70s. And I recorded episode 315. I remember that very clearly. That was one of the episodes that I recorded back in 1982, 83. And so I kept that, and I still had a few of the books, so I would reread those once in a while. So it was always in the background and sometimes in the forefront, but nothing really until 1989. I walked into a Mr. Paperback in Bangor, and they had two items. They had one of the Dark Shadows Files magazines,
Oh yeah,
and
the Ed Gross. Yeah. Uh-huh.
yep, a lot of that, and ended up getting a bunch of those. But they had one of those, and they also had the VCR tape, "The Best of Dark Shadows," the first volume, because they were getting ready to promote the release of the actual series, which was going to be at Halloween of 1989. So that got me started. And then I had a friend who I worked with in community theater who was getting out of fandom. He had a whole box full of stuff. He says, "Give me $100 for it." Turns out there was like 30 or 40 fanzines, World of Dark Shadows and
Oh,
Inside the Old House.
great.
And there was a Dark Shadows Barnabas Collins game in there, and a bunch of other material that had addresses and so on it. So I went ahead and subscribed, and that was in around 1990, the beginning of 1990 to the middle of 1990. And that's how I got back into it again. And I wrote one short story for Kathy Resch, I think, back in, I can't remember, 95, 96, somewhere in there. And I subscribed up until about 2000 to all
Mhm.
that stuff. And then I was starting to get preparing myself to go back to undergrad and finally grad school. So I kind of got away from that. And by that time, the fanzines were starting to kind of go out. But I had a huge collection of Dark Shadow stuff by the time I was ready to go to grad school. And I sold about 90% of it because
Yeah.
I wanted 5 months worth of rent and food and so on. And I got it. I
Yeah.
had a large enough collection. So I started recollecting probably about 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I built
We
up quite a bit of it
we've
again.
all been there. I've done the same thing. When I moved back from California with my late husband, we'd been living in San Francisco for a couple of years, which was very expensive, and I had a ton of Dark Shadows fanzines. And I kept like key items that I wanted to keep. Like I wasn't going to sell the cane and stuff like that. I kept that. But so it's like, no, I'm not selling the cane. But I did sell a lot of my fanzines. I kept a few and I sold them. That now I look back, like, oh, I shouldn't have sold those. But I've
Yeah,
managed to reacquire quite a few of them over the years. Joe Escobar was kind enough to provide there's
yeah.
a Google Drive link that Madeline Marks also makes available.
Madeline, I
Madeline's
love you, Madeline. Thank you so much.
Madeline's wonderful. Yeah, and there you can and Joe too. I mean, those
Yeah,
are really valuable. resources. It's
They are.
important to keep those around. When you do research for your videos or for my podcast, sometimes
Mhm.
I'll pull up one of those files and I'll look through to find some information. They're
Some
very,
great interviews in there too.
oh
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
lots of
absolutely.
great fiction.
Violet Wells interview in one of the
Mhm.
World of Dark
I think
Shadows.
it's the only one she ever gave.
I believe so. Yeah, thank goodness that exists, you know. So I wish we could have I wish there was some interview with Gordon Russell out there too. I wonder if there is somewhere, but he was pretty
Oh,
reclusive and he died kind of
fairly young. Yeah,
young. Yeah.
yeah, he
Oh,
did. I don't know. Ed Gross would probably know if there are any interviews out there. He was conducting a bunch of interviews for a while back.
yeah. Ed was supposed to come on to the podcast at one point, and we never were able to kind of make that set up a date for that. But I got to reach out to him again because he was also one of the gateways for me to discover the fandom was the Dark Shadows Files
Yep.
magazines. I saw the ad in the back of Monsterland magazine, and it was around the same time that my Scrapbook Memories of Dark Shadows came out too. So it was like those two things kind of helped me find my way into the fan community. How about favorite characters and storylines from the show? I don't say favorite character anymore because every time I say that,
It's
people,
true.
nobody
Well,
can really give me one. So
as a
characters.
child, it was hands down Barnabas, of course. I was a
Mhm,
little boy and I identified with all of that. I also identified with David very, very much as a little
mhm,
boy.
mhm.
So those characters really made a grand impression on me back then. But I have to say, I can't take my eyes off of Grayson Hall no matter what she does, whether it's the movie which must not be named or, you know the one I'm talking about, Satan in High Heels. Um,
Yes, yeah. The
um,
one she said, yeah, she
yeah.
claimed she never did that
uh,
movie, even though she was in
Right.
it.
Whether it's that or Night Gallery or Dark Shadows or whatever it is, she's impossible not to notice. You
Yeah.
can't ignore her, even if she's supposed to be
Gargoyles,
in the background.
that darn cat.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Night of the
all
Iguana. She was wonderful. I mean, she was nominated for an
she's
Oscar for
great in
Night of the
that,
Iguana. She was
of course.
fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, she was duly impressive, and
Yeah.
so she'd be one of my favorites. Thayer David for his versatility,
Yeah. Which
incredible.
which Thayer David character is your favorite?
Oh, it would probably be Timothy later Elliot Stokes.
Yeah. Yeah. T.
Um,
Elliott Stokes.
just
Yeah.
because when he walked in a room, he just, even if he was in the dark, he wasn't in the dark. He
Yeah.
knew
Yeah.
some BS was going on here between Barnabas and
Yeah.
Julia, and he was not about it, and he knew it.
Yeah.
So I always liked the way he could take the scene the way he was supposed to, not like completely chew the scenery, but take the scene the way he was supposed to.
Mhm.
And he was also very versatile in terms of his ability to everything from his physical posturing and what we call actor's weight, the way that he would move and walk
Yeah.
and all of those things, and to his vocalizations and his "I ain't gonna do nothing" in one, and then the other one he's very he's
Yeah.
very urbane, and so he would be definitely one.
Okay.
But weirdly, here's a character that always fascinated me because of his physical presence. He was a big, tall man, but he was a minor character. And he used to stand in for Robert Rodin every once in a while as well. And that's Dwayne Morris,
Oh,
who
Dwayne
played
Morris. Yeah. Diablos.
Diablos,
Yeah.
because of his voice. You have summoned me. It's like, well, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
He had a good theatrical sense, and his
Yes.
vocal was very good.
Yeah.
But ultimately, in terms of watching an actor and learning from an actor and learning about precision from an actor, it's Humbert Estrada.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yep.
That's so they all have their niches that I really love.
Yeah.
But Humbert, well, he was a teacher and he also ran a theater.
Mhm.
He did a lot of different things in his career, but he was very physically, vocally, and focus wise, he was very precise. And
Mhm.
I found maybe one or two really tiny screw ups that he made. That's it.
It's very rare. Yeah.
It's like, are you kidding me? Over a period of, I don't know how many episodes,
Yeah.
100 episodes or whatever it was, what it was, he was just so super reliable and also very rich in the way that he portrayed his characters in that precise way.
Yeah. Did you ever get to meet any of the Dark Shadows cast
Yep,
members?
I did. I got patted on the rear end by Louis Edmonds
Yeah, yeah.
in an elevator, and he was such a sweetheart.
Was
I
that at
love
a festival or?
Yes, it was at a festival. It
Okay.
was 99. It was the only festival I ever went to, so it was a memorable one, obviously. I met Catherine Lee Scott. She
Uh-huh.
signed a bunch of stuff for me, just brief kind of encounters like that.
Mhm.
The one I found to be super friendly was Chris Pennick. He
Oh
was
yeah,
super friendly,
yeah,
and it was really like, cool, man. He was just really enthusiastic about the whole thing. Had a really good energy that day. This was one of the last ones that they had at the Marriott,
yeah,
the down before the Twin Towers went down. They had
yeah,
the last one the year of, but
yeah,
9/11. But this was in '99. So, you take the A train down. I
yeah,
had a great time. I had some friends that lived up in the 80s on the west side, so that was
yeah.
cool.
Mhm.
Uh, and spent 2.5, 3 days just kind of hanging out. And I'm a shy guy around a lot of people at first. So I,
Mhm.
I just kind of floated around. I saw Bob Issel there.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's where I bought my Dumb Shadows CDs.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I got
Very
those
Dumb
from
Shadows
Bob too.
and the interviews, the first set of
Yes,
interviews.
same. I got those from Bob through the mail at the time. Uh, yeah.
And
Oh
there's several other fans that I met there. But
yeah, that's
it was
great.
a fun time. I wish I had the wherewithal and the time to have
Yeah.
gone to more. I'm sure you did too. But
Oh, I feel the same way. I only went to 2 of them. I tried to go to the 2016 50th anniversary one, but as I've said many times, it was sold out, and I
Ann
should have.
Wilson's still doing Sacy's, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Ann
There's
was in her
PayPal. We
80s.
have PayPal now. We can.
Bless her. She was
Yeah.
in her 80s. She wasn't going to
Yeah,
change.
I know. Yeah, and she was. It's amazing
She
that
was
she even
really
did that. Yeah.
she's
Uh,
great.
but I wish I had gone to more of them. I too was very shy back then. Especially in the 80s and 90s. I couldn't have imagined kind of doing that on my own at that time. And I wish I had the wherewithal at that time to made the effort or the attempt to go. And I think I would have enjoyed that and getting involved with the Collinsport players. That would have been fun too, because
Yes.
they did some
Yes.
fun stuff. But I wish I had met Humbert, Alan Estrado. He only did one Shadow Con. He went to one of the Shadow Cons. That's the only
Out,
time he ever went.
it was out in
Um,
California, wasn't it?
Yes, in
Yeah.
California, and I know Patrick McRae interviewed him for the Collinsport Historical Society
Mhm.
podcast, which was
Yep.
really great that he did. But I worked with a director here who was a Dark Shadows fan too, and he met Humbert as well. He went to see him in a production of, I think it was Equus. I think he went to see him in
Oh, yes.
I
He
believe
played Dysart in Equus. Yes.
yeah, and
Yeah.
he waited and met him after the show. He went to go backstage or something
That's
to
awesome.
congratulate him on the performance. And of course, he mentioned Nicholas Blair. He's a Dark Shadows
Oh,
fan. He was very nice. Said he was
good. Good.
very friendly and stuff when he met
Yeah.
him. So yeah. Now what about favorite storylines from the show?
Oh God. Right now I haven't been going through entire storylines for a while. I've been going through like 10 episode story arcs.
Okay.
Uh, and I've been just going gaga over 1968, which most people don't go gaga over
Oh, the
1960.
Adam creation of Adam
All
and
of them,
Eve.
yeah,
Oh,
and several sections of it, yeah,
Dream
several sections
Curse. Yeah.
of it. And Angelica's a vampire, the whole thing.
Sure. I love
Um,
that stuff too.
I do
Yeah,
because again, Humbert's in it,
yeah.
and I love watching him not only as a character, but also as an exercise in learning about that kind of precision stage acting.
Mhm.
Uh, but yeah, if I had to go and only have one, would be 1897.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
That's when I and 1795 is fantastic because it was the
yeah,
first of its kind. It was a unique animal in itself and deserves a lot of praise for creating that resident company that where they could play different characters and do all that sort of thing. It was very groundbreaking in its way. But 1897 to me had the most erudite, the most clever, the most witty writing in it, with Violet Wells coming on board and actually getting name credit. She'd done work for Gordon before, apparently.
yeah.
I wasn't even so much a huge fan of getting into 1897 with the kids and all of that stuff because it just seemed to go on for a little bit longer than I wanted it to. There was some good suspense in there, don't get me wrong, but once you got into 1897, you saw how it shifted into third gear. I mean, it was
Yeah.
just go.
Yeah.
at that point.
Firing on all cylinders. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, agreed. And I mean, and you had all the major players in there. I mean, it was just, yeah, I agree. 1897's, if I had to pick one, it would probably would be 1897. Um, and that's typically, honestly, I know a lot of people would recommend starting Dark Shadows from episode one, and there is something to be said for that, absolutely. But typically, when when I people ask me where should I start, a lot of times I will tell them to start with 1897 because I know they'll get hooked if they start with 1897. They might not get hooked if they start with episode 1. They might, they might not, but
they're patient people, they might still get hooked,
yeah,
because a lot of times people are, well, where's the vampire? That's
yeah,
because they've heard that there's a vampire in it.
yeah,
I never tell people because I deal with 18 to 25-year-olds in my classes.
mhm,
I never tell any of them start with one because I know
yeah,
that
same,
what's this? I say, "You go back to that after you get a little sense of context. Maybe look at 1795, look at 1897, because there's some real color in there. And I think you
yeah,
might be interested in that. So that's when
right,
that. So,
yeah, yeah,
I agree. I think starting at one is great. I did that when it first came on the Sci-Fi Channel.
mhm,
I started with one and just watched it. And that was the first time I'd actually seen all of those episodes, was in the early 90s.
mhm,
So that was
yeah,
pretty,
yeah, it was amazing that they finally released those. I mean, that was
yeah, it
well,
wasn't,
we never
they,
thought we would get to see those. I mean, because they weren't in syndication, so it was a quest, to get that and the last year. The first year and the last year, they were not showing in syndication, so it's I remember getting that book, The History of Dark Shadows, which, I think the festival put out. Nina Ogle actually wrote the text for that, but, that was kind of how I was able to really get the fine details of the 1966 stuff, until we finally got to see it. I think I first watched it I don't remember if it was Sci-Fi or the MPI tapes, 'cause I remember MPI released Dark Shadows the
they
beginning,
did in the
so
mid 90s. They
yeah.
started the collector series.
So I
Yeah.
got that, oh, the collector series, that's right, Dark Shadows Collector Series. I got those tapes. All right, so last question here. In the going into the future here, what would you like to see in terms of Dark Shadows in popular culture? Do you think Dark Shadows will continue to maintain a presence in popular culture?
I think it will. It may, how much of a presence is going to depend on people like Mark Perry.
Yeah,
Uh, and because you need to have industry people with track records who have their head on their shoulders and
mhm,
understand entertainment as well as being enthusiastic about the product,
yeah,
which is Shadows. The thing that's tricky about Dark Shadows and I think Mark knows this, a lot of older fans like ourselves, or at least myself,
oh,
um,
I'm right there with you.
um, we tend to want it formatted the way that it was formatted in 1966, which is, of course, it's a daytime serial, and that format is responsible for a lot of the vibe of the show. It's really responsible for the whole idea of you talk about all the literary connections to Dark Shadows. I think of the theatrical connections to Dark Shadows, one
Sure.
of which happens to be classical 19th century melodrama.
Yeah.
Not the stuff like the riverboat stuff with Snidely Whiplash, but the stuff that Dion Busico and several other people wrote back then at the time. Shows like The Streets of New York, which they would change the name of the city everywhere they went when they toured it. So they would get popular references to each city. But anyway, it had spectacle, it had music, not a musical, but a drama with music, which is melodrama. It had the so-called cliffhangers, the act breaks where, oh my God, what's going to happen? Are they going to survive this kind of thing that went on, which Dan Curtis ended up doing every single day,
Yeah.
started doing it once a week, and then every single day. And it doesn't have to be in the close world of television, it didn't have to be action every time. It could be thought,
Yeah.
subtext, but it was always there. It was
Yeah.
always there in some respect. Sometimes in the middle of the show, they would have this sort of thing. So to me, that element is tough to replicate.
Yeah.
So it has to be sort of crafted in a different way, and I really think that it does not serve it well to reboot it. And
Yeah.
I think this is what Mark has said all along. Let's just take it beyond that and do something else with plenty of references
Yeah.
and characters from the original, but not reboot so much. So I think that's a big part of bringing it really firmly back into the consciousness of popular culture. In terms of the show itself and what we have after 55, so almost 60 years now, that we have to take a responsibility and pass on. We do things like podcasts, try to get young people to be interested in it. I just had a 17-year-old that I directed in a staged reading a few months ago who was really interested in vampires and spooky stuff. And I said, this is what you have to do. Go to Tubi, do this, do this, do this. So they're there, they're out there,
Yeah.
and they want to be interested. It's just a matter of, everybody's a true fan, even
Yeah.
the first one, even the
Yeah.
first,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even the last one. So I think we need to cultivate more of those as well. But I
Agree.
certainly hope that Mark is able to come through with the funding, and I know he has the support of DCP and several other people. Now he has to come through with the funding, the full boat, and
Yeah.
I know he's working his tail off on that. So thank you, Mark, for that. Appreciate
Yeah. I'm fingers crossed. Another thing I'm excited about, you have this great show. So how do we find
it.
Collinsport After Dark? Tell us about that.
You can find it on YouTube. It is a podcast. My channel is called Alan Gallant, ALAN space GALLANT. But also, if you just type in Collinsport After Dark in your YouTube search, you will find me.
So this is specifically is a YouTube show
It is because it's really visual right now, especially right now.
It's a great show, folks. If you get the opportunity, which I make the time to check it out, because it's really Alan does a great job, puts a lot of effort into it, and I love just the mix. You have the humor, you have some music in there too. You were playing some great music when you were showing the gum
Try to
cards.
play the stuff that I can get away with, like stuff off of old Seberg discs and stuff like that. Yeah.
It was really cool. It was great. Very evocative of the era too. So I loved that about it too. I'm always wary. I'm like, what can I play? What can I not play? Like I just had
Not easy to tell. It's really not,
I just had David Selby on, and I was like, I can't do a Quentin anniversary celebration and not use Quentin's theme. I had to put it. I hope I don't get in trouble for that. But it's just that I'm not monetizing. It's just a little snippet.
The Charlie Green one might be a little bit easier to.
Yeah. It's too late now. I'm not.
Okay, no problem.
We'll see. Unless if Jim comes.
You have
after me.
Quentin's stamp of approval, it should go through.
I do have a fan MIDI version of the Quentin's theme, so if
God.
I have to, I'll have to replace it with that.
They used to put those on websites back in the 90s. I remember the MIDI themes.
Yes, yeah. There's a fan who did a whole bunch of Dark Shadows ones. Okay, well, Alan, I want to thank you for joining me today. I know you're busy and you're off to.
Good.
Sure.
I'm good. So glad to be here and so honored that you would have me.
Oh my goodness, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to chat with you, and I'm glad we got to speak here after communicating over the last couple of years. It's good to actually get to on Facebook and stuff, but it's great to get to chat with you here, and I hope that many people will be subscribing to your channel. That's the best way to keep up with Alan's content. Make sure to subscribe to Collinsport After Dark, to the YouTube channel Alan Gallant. I will put a link to that in the show notes and in the YouTube description as well. Just click right on through and subscribe and like Alan's videos, and I look forward to many more of them. All right, take care. This episode's going out in time for New Year's Eve, so I want to wish you a very happy New Year. Be sure to check out all of the podcasts I mentioned, Between the Shadows, hosted by Kara Tillitz and Kristen Pierce. It's a wonderful show. I hope they come back soon with some new ones. There's also Dark Paradise, hosted by Rachel Pulliam, which covers Dark Shadows and Strange Paradise. And there's also Resident of Collinwood, hosted by Jewel T. Sains, who is often joined by Patrick McRae and Gordon Domowski. Jewel is undertaking the monumental task of covering every single episode of Dark Shadows, starting from the first one. I wish him luck with that endeavor. That's going to take him a while, but actually with the amount of content that Jewel puts out, maybe he'll get through it faster than I would have, certainly. And speaking of Patrick, I highly recommend you check out his really fun Was the Night Before Christmas, the Dark Shadows version. Actually, I say really fun, but it's actually very touching. I got choked up reading it, so I'll put a link to that in the show notes, as well as to the podcasts I mentioned, including all of the great classic horror podcasts I mentioned, Monster Kid Radio, Classic Horrors Club, Diecast Movie Podcast. There's also Bobby Lugosi with his wonderful Dusty Old Movies channel. Amanda Reyes' Made for TV Mayhem, which is not about Dark Shadows, but she does cover several Dan Curtis TV movies. She was just recently inducted into the Monster Kid Hall of Fame. Definitely encourage you to check out Amanda's podcast. Literary License, which was covering Dark Shadows for a while. I think they still are coming back to that eventually. I'm not sure. I don't think they finished 1841 Parallel Time yet, but hopefully they'll get back to that. They've done some great interviews with cast members, and definitely worth checking out. There's also the Pit of Ultimate Dark Shadows, hosted by Daryl Worrell, which is more of a fan fiction podcast, which is like a hybrid between Dark Shadows and a whole bunch of other shows and movies, etc. So that's another one. So lots of cool stuff out there, and of course, it goes without saying, Collinsport After Dark with Alan Gallant. B is for Barnabas. I look forward to more from Alan. And yeah, definitely very exciting times. And hey, if you want to do a Dark Shadows podcast, now's the time. Give it a shot. What do you have to lose? You know, if you have an angle you want to approach, I get a lot of requests from people who want to come onto this podcast, which I appreciate the enthusiasm, certainly. I'm flattered that people want to be on the podcast. I have a list of people that I still have not brought on who I promised appearances to, so I've currently stopped promising appearances to anybody on the podcast for the time being. Maybe I'll do some like fan corner thing where people can submit a clip and I'll play it if it's short, but I'll cross that bridge later. But hey, you know what? What's stopping you from doing your own Dark Shadows podcast? Why wait to be a guest on somebody else's podcast when you can be the host of your own show? I'd love to see that in 2024. How about some new Dark Shadows fan podcasts or YouTube channels? If you have a specific interesting angle you want to approach Dark Shadows from, or something you want to say, do it. So with that said, have a happy new year, and we'll see you in 2024.
And for as long as they lived, the Dark Shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.